Welcome back to Gray and Gritty, everybody. My name is LJ Winnefeld.
Is Sandy Winnefeld.
And Dad, I don't really have a whole lot to say other than the world has kind of exploded since the last time we recorded. And we were just learning everything about what's happening in Iran then, and things were developing very quickly, and it has continued over the last week.
Yeah, it's been pretty crazy. We've had Ukraine, we've had Venezuela, we had Iran in June, and now we have the big Iran thing going on right now, and it's a chocolate mess.
Yeah, when I sat down to prepare some notes for today's pod, I really didn't even know where to start. There's so much happening on the ground, but I think it'd be maybe a little bit helpful to cage our conversation with a little bit of maybe a recap really quickly, and then we can dive into a couple of narratives surrounding this Iran conflict that I'm really interested to get your thoughts on. Stuff that I've seen primarily on social media, but like anything these days, narratives that are on social media start to bleed into naturally into the larger news cycle. And sometimes I think there's like a self-licking ice cream cone, as you like to say, where a narrative on social media finds traction and actually becomes part of policy. So to start with a quick summary of where we're at with Iran, I know everybody's been probably monitoring the situation pretty closely, but just to level set everybody, over the last week, over 2,000 Iranian military targets have been destroyed. In the first 36 hours alone, consumed over 3,000 precision-guided munition interceptors. IRGC command nodes have been taken out. Most of Iran's navy has been decimated, to include that viral video of a Iranian navy ship being sunk by a torpedo, the first time since World War II for the United States, and the first time since the Falkland War that any ship has been sunk by a submarine-launched torpedo. Since then, there's been a lot of narratives about whether we're going to run out of exquisite munitions. Trump met with the CEOs of the major defense contractors on Friday, and there's also been narratives about how this is interrelated with Venezuela, China, and frankly, the rest of the world. The first thing that I want to talk about, Dad, is ground troops. We talked a little bit about this on a phone call at the beginning of the week. I'm seeing a narrative get spun up on social media about troops going ashore. Primarily lately, it has been Karg Island. I think that's how you pronounce it, way up in the northern part of the Persian Gulf, where Iran has most of its, that's where they do most of their oil exports. I've also seen a little bit of chatter about maybe trying to secure some areas around the Strait of Hormuz. What are your thoughts about ground troops? First of all, where do you think that they could be employed if they are? And do you think they should be employed, and what would that look like?
Yeah, so at one end of the spectrum is if you're going to do regime change, true regime change, it's really hard to do from the air. You have to do it on the ground, and that's just not practical right now. You look at how many troops we had. It took 6 months to prepare this for Iraq, and that's just not set up right now. So the only purpose for ground troops in this would be for something that really makes a difference in the objectives that the administration is trying to achieve. And if you think about those four objectives, one is regime change. That's not happening with ground troops. I don't think that's going to be a player. Another one is what I like to call the 3H Club, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. That's not a ground troop thing at all. And another one is the destruction of Iran's military, and that's being done from the air quite gradually but effectively. So the last one is the nuclear program. To me, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to try to take either Karg Island or Keshem Island, which is at the top of the Strait of Hormuz. It could be done because you could do it, but I don't know what purpose it would serve, and it could be quite costly. The real thing that I've been hearing more seriously than anything is trying to recover the highly enriched uranium that was potentially buried under Natanz during the June strikes. The nuclear program has, quote, been obliterated. And I think it's fair to say that the Iran's ability to enrich uranium probably has been pretty well obliterated. But those canisters of 60% enriched uranium are sort of the big deal in the nuclear thing right now. And to send ground troops in to do that, special operations forces, whether they're Israelis or U.S. forces, would be incredibly risky. The Iranians are expecting this. They're prepared for it. And that stuff is buried under a lot of dirt right now, and just getting in there and getting to it could be a challenge. So I think it's unlikely to happen. I think it would be potentially a mistake if it happens, but it remains to be seen what tricks the administration has up its sleeve, what tricks CENTCOM has up its sleeve. There may be something that we haven't anticipated.
The one thing about this administration, to your last point there, is it seems like whenever we think they're going to do something, they end up doing something completely different, right? For me, when it was Venezuela, I thought, okay, maybe we are going to strike their oil capacity ashore, or maybe take out Maduro with a kinetic strike, and then they go and they do that pretty incredible raid to pull him out of Venezuela. And so it could be the same thing here with Iran. Maybe not obviously a raid to pull a leader out, but to go and get this nuclear enriched material and to kind of set the stage. Because I know when we were having this conversation earlier, I asked you, what does this look like, right? Like what are they going to go grab? What is the Special Operations SEAL Team 6 going to go pick up? And you said it was almost like scuba tanks full of enriched uranium. That could be spread out all across the country. And for me, it's kind of like, okay, one, where is it? How do you know where it is? Does the Mossad know? Does the CIA know? And then two, if you do know where it is, it's probably not all co-located in one place. At least if I was Iran, the Iranian regime, I would not put everything in one place underground. I would spread it out across the country, so it's very hard, and you might have to do multiple operations. And to your point, the Iranians probably know that that is the next target. I think that they're okay if we seize an island, maybe not okay, but if we seize an island in the Persian Gulf, yeah, that's not great, but it's not the end of the world. But if we go after the nuclear material, I think that is the last trump card, the last bargaining chip, if you will, that they have in any kind of negotiation.
So I wouldn't rule out potentially some exquisite intelligence that they may have. And when they say, oh, that wouldn't happen for a couple of weeks, then I get nervous that it could happen tomorrow, right?
Yeah, that seems to be the narrative.
Things tend to happen on weekends, so it remains to be seen. But but the bottom line is, I don't see any large scale ground troops going in. You might have to have a lot of troops to secure an objective long enough for you to go in and get that stuff if you know where it is. So that could be a localized large ground incursion, 82nd Airborne with Special Operations Forces, that kind of thing. But, I don't want to get too far ahead of the game on this. We'll just have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, and of note for that last point that you had, the 82nd Airborne canceled a training operation here in the United States that they were going to go and conduct, which means that maybe they are preparing to do something. But that could also mean there's a lot of other reasons why they could have canceled. Maybe there were different operational training objectives, all the way down to maybe they just wanted to put the funding somewhere else. Or maybe they canceled it so that they could focus on planning for an operation that never actually happens. Because to plan for something so complex like securing an objective so that you can pull nuclear material out, or, seizing an island in the Persian Gulf, takes a lot of planning and a lot of time. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're about to go into Iran.
So I'll just say two things. One, I'm not going to armchair quarterback this thing. And the other thing is, the military has performed so well in Venezuela and so far with this Iranian conflict, even though I think it's been a little bit of a surprise for us on how resilient the Iranians have been in striking back. But I do have a sense that if we do this, we're going to do it right.
One other thing with respect to really kind of the kinetic side of this Iranian conflict, before we move on to how this plays in the larger geopolitical sphere, Russia has been sharing intelligence with Iran. It's been widely reported over the last few days. The Secretary of Defense or War been asked about this on different news programs that he's been on. What are your thoughts with respect to that? I have some thoughts as well, but I'd love to hear yours.
Well, first of all, I don't think anybody should be surprised by this. I mean, come on. And the other thing, sort of like what goes around comes around. It's not like we haven't been sharing intelligence with Ukraine regarding, Russia and Russian movements and targets and things like that. So I can argue forever that our cause is more just than the Russians' cause, but nobody should be surprised or outraged even that the Russia would be sharing intelligence with Iran. Doesn't seem to have been doing a whole lot of good yet. They haven't hit a ship, and the targets they seem to be hitting are targets that everybody would have known about anyway. To me, I'm not overly exercised about this.
Yeah, I was a little surprised at all the pearl clutching that I saw online about how outrageous it was that Russia was doing this when in reality they've done it before. They shared intelligence with the Taliban when we were in Afghanistan. We're sharing intelligence with Ukraine that's directly leading to their combat success on the ground. So it's not a surprise that they're doing the same. And that's an unintended consequence. Whenever you get into a conflict anywhere in the world, there are going to be other outside players that are going to stick their hands in the pot. And it's unfortunate because it could potentially lead to destruction of military equipment and the loss of life. But I don't think that it should come as a surprise. And frankly, I think the pearl clutching is kind of, I don't know, a little bit too blob-ish for me.
So it's a little bit like people freaking out over China purging some of its military leaders. Well, take a look back over the last year or so. Have we done the same thing? Yes, we have.
So the next piece that I want to talk about, Dad, is a growing narrative, not just online, but in the conversations that I'm having daily with people both in and out of the military, the interconnected nature between Venezuela, Iran, and China and the larger geopolitical sphere. A lot of the narrative, kind of circles around the fact that by securing relations with Venezuela, by taking control essentially of that oil and doing the same with Iran, not just the nuclear piece, but also the oil piece, because everything seems to be about oil, that what we've done is one, and we talked about this last week, but I think it's worth rehashing, that we're putting more pressure on China with respect to oil because they get a decent amount of oil, not an overwhelming amount, but enough to be impactful from both Iran and Venezuela, but that it's essentially preventing a conflict with China down the line that might, stop them from invading Taiwan or moving on other strategic objectives. What are your thoughts with this narrative that all of these are kind of interconnected and then it's kind of like 3D chess that the administration is playing on China?
First of all, it's really easy to weave conspiracy theories. It's kind of like an American occupation, right? It's like we try to put, two and two together and make 10. First of all, when an administration does something like this, it's almost impossible to keep it quiet. Somebody in the administration is going to link, aren't we clever with what we're doing here? And this is all about China. And it's just not happening. I really do believe that Venezuela was about president, kind of from a New York perspective, securing his own backyard and taking care of that. And yeah, there was some oil involved, but Venezuelan oil is not very good oil, and it's going to take a long time and a lot of money to get that taken care of. In Iran, I feel strongly both ways. It's about time this regime fell, and I think the Trump administration lost patience with them on nuclear negotiations and realized that they've been doing nothing but harm in the region and all over the world for the last 50 years, and it was time to whack them. I don't think they were thinking, oh, yeah, China, this is all about China. Now, is there a side effect here where oil exports from Venezuela to China are certainly not in a happy place right now? It goes without saying that if, with the Strait of Hormuz closed, that exports to China from the Arabian Gulf, whether they're from Iran or not, are being shut down. But that's only going to be temporary. But I do think, on the other hand, as maybe an unintended consequence, it is throwing a little bit of a reality check into China's calculus that, we can act around the world, we can make life difficult for them, we can cut off some of their lifeline for oil. And it's very interesting coming in advance of a summit between President Trump and President Xi Jinping of China. It maybe strengthens the president's hand when he walks into that room, even though Xi Jinping is playing a pretty strong hand right now on the trade side.
That's what I was going to bring up next, is the fact that they're having this summit meeting at the end of the month, and if this adds extra leverage to the side of the U.S. administration, and I think it does. I think that there's really kind of two, the knife cuts both ways with respect to this. Yeah, we're putting more pressure on China. I think the narrative of that this was 3D chess, it was planned out strategically. I don't really think there's a lot of there with respect to that. But I do agree with you that the secondary, third, fourth order effects of putting more pressure on China, sending a signal to China to prove to them we're not just all talk. We are able to affect things around the world. But I do believe that while you are adding this leverage, this pressure on China through oil and through the exerting military power and might, you're also expending a lot of munitions that could potentially be used in a conflict as well. So while you're doing that and you're showing this, you're also essentially telling the Chinese and the rest of the world, because we only have a certain amount of capacity. The United States military does not have an unlimited amount of ability and weapons. And so you're basically telling the rest of the world for the next couple of years, especially with how, public it has been, this conversation about the lack of exquisite munitions, you're telling the rest of the world that we may not be able to do something like this until 2027 or 2028. So it does cut both ways. Yeah, you are putting pressure, but you might also be opening a door a little bit. And if that window of opportunity is only small and China knows that you are putting pressure on them with respect to oil, that might lead to other cascading effects, maybe potentially getting them to launch sooner. Although I don't think that they're going to make a decision on that solely based off of what we're doing in Iran.
Yeah, and I've been reading a lot about what the Chinese are saying internally about this conflict between the United States and Iran, and there are some interesting themes going on there. But one of them is, sort of, here we go again. Let's let the United States be distracted in the Middle East while we just continue to quietly work our way towards what it is we want to do. It's a factor. It's there, but I don't think it was the principal calculus behind this.
Yeah, and that's a great point because China's rise happened while we were distracted by two quagmires in the Middle East for an extended period of time. But that point of this cascading effect of us being in Iran, there is one final narrative that I've seen online and I've discussed with some of my peers. The fact that we are already in World War III, we just don't know it yet. And that World War III actually started when Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022. Zelensky said this. He said that to the BBC that Putin already started World War III. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, said in a speech that World War III has already begun. And to see all of these hotspots happening around the world with that same thought in mind that everything is interconnected, it is easy, especially if you are, kind of a doomsday kind of person, to see how this could potentially lead us into a large global scale, conflict. And we've talked about some of this in the past. What are your thoughts? Do you think that we're in World War III? Do you think that the risk, if we're not, that the risk is really, really high? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so if you look back through history, we're actually probably in like World War VI, but we just tend to think in terms of what happened in the 20th century. And so, yeah, I don't know that I would call it World War III, but it is very symptomatic of what you would consider the unraveling of the current geopolitical cycle, long wave cycle that started at the end of World War II. And these cycles tend to end in a very convulsive way. They end for a lot of reasons. I think we've talked about this before, where you have a rising power that's very, very ambitious, with probably an authoritarian streak, and then you have a prevailing power that's starting to sort of run out of gas. It's overextended itself financially. We have a $1.9 trillion deficit this year in the United States. It's overextended itself militarily, and we've had a tendency to do that over the last couple of decades. Internal political divisions, generations that forget the bloody cost of these convulsions, and it's all kind of coming together. And then on top of that, there's sort of the devolution of the rule of law into the rule of power. And we're seeing that as well, where this attack against Iran was very much against international law and domestic law, but it's almost like that doesn't matter anymore. So I don't argue with, and every world war is different. This one is starting in a different way than the previous ones did. I think, though, that it's a very good clarion call, a warning signal to us that we really need to have our house in order if we're going to make it through this. No great power ever had a weak economy. We need to get our economic house in order. That's going to be very difficult to do politically in a democracy where people are reelected every 2 or 6 years in the House and the Senate. It's going to take some inspired, mature, courageous leadership for us to gather the national strength to make it through this, if it is what people are saying it is.
There are a couple of narratives here that I think have become somewhat mainstream over the last decade or so. The first one that comes to mind, you talk about a rising power with an already established power. And that really brings back, Thucydides' trap, right, with Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, with China and the United States. China being the rising power, the United States being established, trying to hold on to that grip and all of the cascading effects of that. And then the second one is, Ray Dalio talks about this a lot as well, about how countries go broke in the debt crisis, and how, when a country gets an enormous amount of debt, an uncontrollable amount of debt, they lose, being the reserve currency in the world, that then typically does not end very well for that country. It's typically very violent, and there's a mass overthrow. And this is kind of that fourth turning in those long wave geopolitical cycles that you talk about. And I think it's very, very easy to kind of connect those with what we're seeing happening all around us. And one of the tropes, for World War I and World War II was the signs were everywhere that there was going to be conflict, and people were in positions where they could have potentially stopped or, made the conflict less worse than it actually was. And that we're in one of those moments right now, is that we could stop this, we could head this off, we could handle our debt, we could stop getting involved overseas, we could do all of these things, but we're just not. And that's just kind of how typically countries find themselves in war. But there's also the other side of it, where I think it's very hard to predict what's going to happen next at any point in history. I mean, before 2000, they were talking about the end of history as we know it, and an everlasting long peace, where the United States was a hegemonic power, and there was never going to be any conflict. It was, Thomas Friedman, two countries with McDonald's and then would never go to war, and then you had Ukraine and Russia that both had McDonald's, eventually went to war. So I think it's very easy to make these grand predictions, when in reality we're very, very bad at predicting what comes next. And history rhymes, it doesn't repeat. But I think both sides of those, I think it's important to take a measured approach, and to not make, which we don't, but to not make grand statements about, oh, yes, we are absolutely in World War III, or we are, we're nowhere near it.
So I'm reminded of Winston Churchill saying one time something like, "The train is off the tracks and gathering momentum," on the one hand.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you have to wonder what if you were in Xi Jinping's head right now. He's watched Vladimir Putin basically fail in Ukraine with the same military culture that his military has, even though I would argue that Xi Jinping's military is probably better than the Russian military. He's also watched us do this exquisite operation in Venezuela, going after a leader. And then the operation in Iran, where on the first day of the war, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, was taken out. If I were Xi Jinping, I would be thinking, yeah, maybe they're running out of high-end munitions, but these guys are pretty good. So I don't think he's going to be in a rush because of this to do anything. And I stick with my prediction right now that he won't do it before the end of summer 2028. That doesn't mean he will do it at the end of 2028, but that seems to be a pretty sweet spot. And I don't see any reason. He's happy to sit back and gather his own strength and watch us potentially self-destruct, at least in his mind, what we're doing. Hopefully that won't really happen.
And real quick, can you recap why you think it's going to be after the summer of 2028?
Yeah, the Davidson window is like 2027, right? And
that's the number everybody talks about, yeah.
Yeah, that's the number everybody talks about. And for one thing, Xi Jinping has told his military, you got to be ready in 2027. Xi Jinping has his 21st Party Congress in November of 2027, which is when he will be reelected for his unprecedented fourth term. He's already in an unprecedented third term, but he'll get his fourth term. And he wants to be there as long as he's alive, because that's what you need to do to survive if you're a Chinese leader. So that's sort of, a time point. And he is probably not going to want to take any chances before then, where he could make a mistake with a failed invasion of Taiwan, whatever. He wants to reconsolidate his power in November of 2027. And then the winter is a very, very difficult time to do anything across the Taiwan Strait. It's a very rough body of water at all times, especially in the winters. Then you get into the spring and the summer, and in the spring of the summer of 2028 is the Los Angeles Olympics. And if you remember that Vladimir Putin didn't invade Ukraine until after the Sochi Winter Olympics were over, China does not want to be a pariah on the world stage. It wants to demonstrate the superiority of its system and its athletes in the Summer Games in Los Angeles. And those games end at the end of July 2028. And then we enter into one of the most, if not the most, contentious presidential elections in our nation's history. What a perfect time to strike. Although, again, I'm not predicting that he will do it then. I just don't think he'll do it before then.
Yeah, I think that's an important caveat as well, is that he will not do it in summer of 2028, but it won't happen prior to that. And I think that those are very, very important reasons that get at a larger strategic view of Xi and of the Chinese Communist Party, because 2027, that's when he said you need to be ready. I think a lot of people have attached themselves to that it's going to be in the summer of that year. But I think that when you actually look at, and we, I think as Americans, don't do a very good job of this, of realizing that other countries have governments that have cycles, that have politics, that have social cycles to them. And I mean, at the strategic level, we definitely do this, but I'm talking about more the Gen Pop folks in America, where we kind of project ourselves onto other cultures. And again, I agree with you. I think that after the Olympics, while you've got the Republican and Democratic national conventions going, there's a lot of fervor in the news. I think that would be the opportune time for him to go. One question I did have for you, because you were talking about the Olympics and that being kind of a staple for whether or not Xi would do an invasion across the strait. Do you think that it entered into the calculus to the Trump administration to not launch Iran strikes until after the Winter Olympics in 2026? I can think of a multitude of reasons, safety of athletes abroad, it being a very international event. Typically countries don't like to do things that would put them in a negative light on the national stage before or during the Olympics. Do you think that entered into the calculus at all?
Yeah, I haven't really thought of that. It's possible. I think they were more focused on the negotiations with Iran on their nuclear program, and those blew up last Thursday, where the Qatari foreign minister said, "Hey, there was some progress made," but the U.S. said, not so much. It's possible that they waited until after the Olympics. I wouldn't rule that out, but I think it was just sort of taking its own course. And the Israelis, I think the thing that really drove it was the Israelis, through their own intelligence, detecting that there was going to be a major meeting of the supreme leader and his leaders, his subordinate leaders, on a Saturday morning and a particular day in March. And I think that was really what drove the timing, not the Olympics.
Real quick before we end the episode, I got two questions for you. They are somewhat predictions, so feel free to abstain. What are the odds on U.S. troops on the ground in the month of March?
I would say 20%.
Okay. And then
don't ask me about Israeli troops on the ground. That
Okay.
might be a little higher.
Okay. So you think that Israeli troops would be more likely than American troops in this kind of a situation?
I do. The reason for that is that the risk that's really involved in this is a nuclear weapon that Iran would develop that could be targeting Israel. So Israel has a lot more skin in that game to accept the kind of risk associated with troops on the ground than the U.S. does. But
I think that's
I could be wrong. But that's the way I'd be playing it if I was the Trump administration. It's like, okay, you want to go get these things? We'll back you up with air power. We'll do whatever it takes, but you're going to be the guys putting the stuff on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it would also be politically more tenable for the administration to support Israeli troops, because if it's not America's sons and daughters on the ground in Iran, I think that would be a lot easier for the president to sell to the American people. The next question is, do you think that this Iran conflict spreads to other countries in more than it already has with respect to strikes in the next, 30 days?
I don't think so. I mean, what other countries is it going to spread to, for one thing? I think the thing to watch for in the next 30 days, you're hearing coming out of Central Command that, the number of ballistic missile attacks from Iran is dropping rapidly. The number of drone attacks from Iran is dropping rapidly and the like. But I think it's also fair to say that to get 80% of that stuff takes maybe 20% of the effort. And then to get the other 20% of the Iranian stuff, which is well hidden, mobile, it's going to keep coming at you, is going to take 80% of the effort. So, and we're seeing that in spite of all of the good news, actually, that the number of strikes has decreased. I still get alerts constantly, every hour of things blowing up in Bahrain, UAE, and the like. So Iran is not going to give up without a fight. This is existential for them. They proved during the Iran-Iraq War that they were willing to take enormous sacrifices,
Over a million people,
without giving in. Yeah. So it's going to be a while and a lot of effort to nail down those last few targets. But I don't see it spreading to any additional countries.
Yeah. I think that is a really good point, again, at the end there. The amount of suffering, and this is not I don't want to paint a broad brushstroke of the entire Iranian people, but if you look at other, Iran, Russia, China, other countries, their tolerance for pain is a lot higher than ours is. And we've talked a little bit about this. You talk about in World War II, we had deaths and casualties on the order of hundreds of thousands of Americans. The Russians had it on the order of tens of millions, and they would have kept fighting until the very, very bitter end. And it very similar, you talk about the Iran-Iraq War, well over 1 million casualties in that war. And it was long. It was a 9-year war. The Ayatollah was trying to bolster his power. He used the war as a way to do that. They could have ended it sooner. That's a whole other conversation. But the tolerance for pain from that society and those people is a lot higher than in the United States. We're talking about 7 service members now who have unfortunately lost their lives, and that is a huge deal, as it should be, in my opinion. But with respect to other countries, that's not always the case. And again, it's that projection of our American society and our American thoughts onto other countries without critically thinking about how their social cycles and how they think and how they work.
Yeah, and the model of that is when the Israelis do a prisoner swap with Hamas or Hezbollah, it's usually 1,000 Hamas prisoners for like 2 Israelis. And if I were on the Hamas side of that, I'd be going, wait a minute, that doesn't really sound right. 1,000 of my guys are worth 2 of theirs. They're thinking of it as a good deal. Hey, look, we got 1,000 people and we only had to give up 2. But there's a subtler message. Yeah. So anyway,
absolutely.
So stay tuned. It's going to be a really interesting week to see how this thing continues to grind along. And whether there are any big events that happen over the course of the next week, or if it's just now settled into a slugging match with pretty much air supremacy over Tehran and the rest of Iran, where we just continue to take out military targets and try to get some sort of capitulation from Iran. But it doesn't look like it's coming anytime soon.
Yeah, it is certainly an exciting time to be alive. It's an interesting time period. Most definitely. Well, Dad, it was a great episode. Thanks again. If you're new, because we have a lot of new subscribers to the channel, to the Substack. If you have questions or want to hear us talk about something and hear our perspective, please feel free to drop us a comment or shoot us a message directly. And if you're a paying subscriber, thank you so much. You are literally helping us improve the quality of content that we produce, and more of that is going to be coming. Looking forward to seeing you again next week, Dad.
Okay. Take care.
Awesome. Bye, everybody.